Up was conceived as a title about 8 years ago, I think. I had a lot of material even then, and there was still quite a lot of it was quite positive, and I was thinking about rivers and also playing with up the Khyber, up the Ganges, up the Mississippi series, where I would send the record off to a group in different countries and they would do their interpretation of it, and then we'd try and sort of pull something together out of that or put those out as individual things. So it was a sort of up package. But I think I mentioned that to Michael Stipe, and they were the first to come out with a record called Up, although I think now Shania Twain is going to have a record called Up, and Annie DeFranco had a record called Up, 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 I think. There was some argument of whether it's past its sell-by date, and we actually put it up on the website whether people wanted it or not, and I think it was just in favor of the Up vote. So I decided to keep Up. I think also there's this thing about up and down in the record too, and I'll be playing with that on tour. So things last time were these two stages of male-female stage and urban, rural, and this next lot is sort of shifted 90 degrees and more about heaven and earth, I think. Up is a positive word, and I think if I listen to the music now, there's some pretty miserable songs there, so I don't know that it fits that well, but I've sort of grown with it, and I think perhaps, personally, I'm in a good place at the moment, and I think probably more up than previous couple of albums, say, and so maybe there's some relationship there, but I don't think there's so much relationship in the music itself. And I've always found it harder to write happy music than sad music. And I had sort of thought that there was a bit of a hospital anthem of sort of Sew Us Up that I could string together. So it had a sort of logic to it. Well, the record I was going after was the amount of time it takes to make a record. I think I enjoy the process of making music better than being a traveling salesman. So I think I've in part been sort of avoiding getting into it, and then I do tend to get attracted to detours, to the accompaniment of trumpet, and Ovo with the Dome was one of those detours, and then there was this soundtrack, Long Walk Home. And I also want to try and take stuff in, because I think often, when you make a record, you're spewing stuff out, and unless you've had enough input, how can you expect it to be interesting or have any new things to reflect on or comment on? I think that process is a slow process for me, and if I go into the studio there, we've got 130 song ideas, not all finished songs that we were working on, so I would sort of go from one thing to another and then to another, and I wasn't really focused on a small group of songs. People always ask me, when's the album coming out? And I always say September, and never give away what year I'm talking about. So it's sort of tended to drift a little further than I'd intended. But it feels like there's a lot of stuff now ready to come out. I've been very fortunate that I don't have to put out a record if I don't want to. So it's more when it feels ready, and when I feel ready to go out into the world again. They come from all over the place, and always on every record there's been one or two that have been sort of left over from the one before, and Sky Blue on this record too came from an earlier period, so even before that 10 years. I think I just throw up stuff that interests me, whether it's from melodically or more often rhythmically, and then just keep trying to develop it. It's like trying to grow fruit, and eventually it feels so heavy enough or ripe enough, if you squeeze it, that it might bear some juice. Well, some of the ideas are there early on, and so helping to shape the feel of the music, but the actual slog work of the lyrics is something I have to go away for usually, and it's something like anything from half a day to 10 days for me to nail a lyric usually. And I would go away sometimes to stay in a bed and breakfast or drive around the place, and I have to do that on my own. And in fact, I think that travel is good for lyrics for me. I still come in most days, at least by midday, and I'm rarely out before midnight. And I think this is actually a very sad life sometimes. And I do want to cut that down and have more civilian night times. I have a sort of messy, sprawling technique of writing, really, which you throw all this stuff at the wall, and then you just chip away and spiral inwards and try and find the center. I remember talking to George Martin about this as a sort of production technique, and he was appalled, all sort of the waste and the involved, because he could only envisage having a definite result in mind that you went straight to, and you knew how to get there. I mean, I've tried that too, but I'm just not very good at it. And that's, I work this other way. I think all the computer stuff has affected the writing. I mean, the ease with which you can change things and try ideas. So, I mean, generally, music when I started was about what you could achieve, that you could generate yourself. And now it's much more what you can conceive of. We always seem to be trying to push the technology one stage further than it's ready for. So there's a lot of time sitting around while computers get fixed. But the possibilities are fantastic. So I think there is that shift away from physical technique towards ideas that has happened as a result of the technology. You have now not just the musicians that you happen to know or can afford to pay, but a huge range of sounds at your disposal. So the process of how you make decisions becomes much more critical, and I guess that's something which also slows me down. Having a studio for me is an incredible luxury for two reasons. One, it allows me, without worrying too much about money, to explore ideas as much or as little as I want. But more important in some ways, there's a real wide range of music being created around here, and that feeds me, just hearing stuff or talking to people. And if I hear a particular musician that I think, oh, that's great, that would be fantastic on that track, I can try and hijack them. And I think having the studio here has really served me as an artist in keeping me amongst musicians and music. We started off when I had a place in Senegal, and we went out there to do some of the writing and work with some of Youssou's guys who I've worked with many times now, and they're fantastic. I didn't at that point have much in the way of songs developed, so it was a little premature, but it was interesting because then we went to the mountains in France and went out on learning to snowboard at that time. And in fact, it was interesting comparing the hot, environment versus cold environment, because my house didn't have air conditioning or anything like that, so I would sit there sometimes with a towel on my head full of ice cubes, water dribbling, because it was incredibly hot, and everything in Africa takes about 5 times as long to get done as you imagine. So what is already a slow process was, I think, even slower there, even though the musicians and the people were fantastic. France, actually, when we were there, was great. We would work in the morning, we'd get out on the snow in the afternoon, and we'd work in the evening. And it was the most efficient, sort of creative period for me, even though it sounds, a bit of a con. And I find, too, when I'm on the snow, I cannot think about anything else but, probably trying to stay up and survive. So it's really relaxing. I think it brings air into music, and it sort of takes it into places that you wouldn't normally go. And I think there are real advantages sometimes to being in a band, and the real advantages being outside of a band, being a sort of solo artist. And I think that I have the best of both worlds, in that I try and do some band sessions where you get people playing together that know each other, that have shorthand, and at the same time, we then take quite a while to bring in other people and try different adventures on each song. The key to collaborating is to listen, and to allow someone space to do what they can do well. I am so fortunate, both through this place with Real World Records and WOMAD, and just who we've got to know over the years, that we know a lot of extraordinary musicians. So that's how I like to work. I think we're trying to get the best of both worlds. I think I've always wanted to have my cake and eat it. I think some bits are personal, and some bits are less sort of specific about relationships and more sort of observations on life, really, I think. And I would say it's less relationship focused, but still quite a personal record. He has very clear ideas about what is good and bad. I don't always agree with them, but it's very useful having someone in the process, who's as clear as he can be. Maeve, my wife now, is also similarly very critical when she was working here too, and we get different people to score ideas. In fact, because this record has gone on for so long, even though we've been going out 7 years before that, she was working here, and I asked people to score things out of 100, and most people are sort of polite enough to keep the score above 50. But she, I think, went down to 14 on one occasion, and but it's useful, I think, for me to have some scathing critics before the record goes out in the world. Peter Green is someone who I think was, one of the key British musicians when I was growing up, and enormously talented. Clearly, he did go off the rails a bit, but I think very often if someone has that amount of ability, that are going to be that it can resurface in all sorts of ways. I was very keen to see if we could persuade him to play something on it. And in fact, he did a session down here and then a session in the studio where he normally works. And I sort of wanted a solo that was sort of is in the style of the solos that I grew up with, that would sort of float above it. But he really didn't want to sort of grab the limelight and steam in there. He was sort of sitting back in a supportive role. Danny did a couple of tracks, and in fact, there's one which will now, I think, be on the next record, but did some fantastic playing, and he's extraordinary player. And what also I like about him is that he wants the stuff ahead of time, so he's got a sense, he does his homework before he comes into the studio. Most people just turn up on the day and, fire away. But I think because he's so loose in one way, but so precise in another, that he likes to get some sense of the sort of phrases he's going to use and the sort of type of motifs that he's going to put around places. But he's an extraordinary character and a great pleasure to work with. I can hear some things that seem to have some relationship, but I remember seeing Patti Smith interviewed once when she was saying there's sort of a whole punk phenomenon, all modern music had come out of her music, and I thought, well, I know it's easy to think like that, but hold on a minute. As with myself, I respond to all sorts of influences, and I think most other people do. I think when you're late teens, early 20s, there may be particular artists that you try and emulate and ape. And often, actually, you find yourself by trying to imitate the people you like best. So I would never discourage anyone from copying any artist, because I think that's how you can find your own voices, by exploring others. Yeah, I'm going to do some touring around this record and venture out on the road again. Initially in America, I'm sort of signed up to do a tour there November, December, and then I'm sure to do something in Europe next year. I still really enjoy visual things, and Robert Lepage, who I worked with on the last tour, who I think is a sort of real visionary, and I don't normally enjoy going to the theatre that much, but his work, it's really theatre for people who've grown up watching films. It's very visual and what I would call high moisture content. There seems to be sort of some mystery and depth and emotion around it. So some of the things I enjoy doing most now are brainstorming with interesting people, and doing a visual tour, gives me a chance to do that, particularly with Robert. In the early days of video, there were no rules really, so it was a lot freer in a sense, because people didn't know what was required to make a successful video. If it looked interesting, entertaining, or different, it sort of tended to get on. Now, it's a more cynical commercial environment, and I think it's quite difficult for people that are trying to make something work artistically, if you like, visually, to get enough plays to warrant the budget to create it. All a healthy part of growing up. I can look at it in a more detached way now, in a more critical way, I think. But I think the good things that had some spirit and emotion still work for me, and there's quite a lot of stuff that falls by the wayside. I think I would draw a big distinction between writing a song for a film, where you're sort of doing your thing and they're slapping it in there, often to try and get a soundtrack album that they can get a bit of cash back on, but that's another story. And creating a soundtrack, which is where you're trying to really build ambiences and sound landscapes that will sort of serve whatever's going on in the picture. Darkness was titled House in the Woods and is about fear. For myself and for a lot of other people, it's the fear that stops you doing things that you could gain an awful lot from. So I was just sort of looking at that in myself. It feels to me more a sort of bookends record, and it looks at beginning and end of life more than the middle period. And so the sort of childhood references in this song. I grew up on this farm near Horsell Common, which is where the Martians landed in H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, but it was quite a sort of moody place to play in as a kid. And there was this woman who was squatting in the woods in a caravan, and you could never tell if it was occupied, but, you know, we'd heard noises in there from time to time, and there was a newspaper over all the windows, so you couldn't look in. I think to our sort of 5-6-year-old imagination, she was a witch and very scary, so we always ran very fast when we crossed the path by her caravan. My brother-in-law died of cancer. My parents are getting a lot older. You know, I've seen a couple of friends die, and then so death has definitely been more present in the last 10 years, and it's been quite interesting in some ways. And so I've read a bit more about it and so on. And I think too, there's this sense very often that people seem to retain their 17-year-old selves throughout life in some way. I mean, they may peg it at a different age, but I don't think people feel old internally, or very rarely. Physically, they do. And there was this sense of never really having landed, you know, at the point when you look back over life and maybe float somewhere else. Sky Blue is the oldest track on the record, and in fact, we had one go at it on the last record. It may even been before then. In fact, the original sort of riff, dee-da-da-dum-down, is probably 15 years old or something. But it was something I'd always liked and felt had some good emotion in it. And as a teenager, I was sort of very influenced by soul and blues, and that was my sort of starting point to a lot of music. And I think this was definitely an influence on that track. And we made it less of a band piece and emptied out the mix. And I had the wonderful chance, you know, to work with the Blind Boys of Alabama, and they are just extraordinary voices. I mean, extraordinary people too, but the voices are lived in. And they have a different type of quality to them than young voices. I think it's one of my favorite sort of emotional bits on the record. The rhythm track of No Way Out was one of the earliest we began working on, and then it had more of a Latin feel. Chris Hughes took it and did this programming thing with it, which with a thing called Super Collider. But what it tends to do is break everything up into lots of little pieces and then sort of reassemble them, but still very granulated. And it has this sort of strange, mysterious percussion quality to it. I mean, I think throughout, on this record, I've been lucky enough to work with some of the best drummers in the world, some extraordinary percussionists, and that is definitely one of the things that gives me pleasure. One of the things over the years that's sort of amazed me in some ways is how people use songs once you sort of say goodbye to them. And there was one American comic who came up to me, and I'd always liked his work, and said, you know, I think that song "Don't Give Up" saved my life, and you know, I was suicidal, and just kept on playing it. And all sorts of other people have sort of used that song as an emotional tool, really. And I started to think, well, if you have songs as emotional tools, then what do we not really have? And there aren't really many songs that deal with grief properly, I think. So I thought, okay, I'll try and deal with a grief song. It sort of starts off, you know, with this pretty melancholy loss, and then you have this sort of sense that life is coming back in the middle, and then at the end, a gentle reminder that actually you have lost something that you loved. So it was sort of constructed, if you like, as an emotional tool. Well, in a way, this is the odd man out on the album, because it's all of the other tracks grew out of the sort of the sessions, and there's still many other songs. But when we were sort of selecting which out of, say, the final 30 to go for more specifically to try and nail, this came back into the running, because it's always been one that I've enjoyed a lot. And so when we were looking at all the different stuff that was around, it seemed like it was more up than some of the other tracks and might be a nice counterpoint. It's probably, again, along with Sky Blue, the most sort of soul references in the music, and in some ways the least thought about, and it, you know, grew out of a sort of a jam, effectively. The melody I'd actually proposed for the Dome project, and it had been sort of rejected, but I always liked it. So I thought I'd do a lyric to it. It's of the bookends approach lyrically. It's the tail end that you're looking at there, as a parachute drop, as without knowing where you're going to land. Barry Williams is definitely an observation on TV culture, and I didn't realize at the time of choosing the name Barry Williams, which was effectively out of a hat, there would be various well-known Barry Williams as a Welsh rugby player, as an actor who was in the Brady Bunch in America, and now it's sort of, we've got samples that have been running on our website, and so people are sort of speculating on why I would make references to the Brady Bunch and so on. And I think we're also sort of dealing with the lyrics and whether they're going to get on radio now, which is something that really hadn't occurred to me, because I don't think any of the lyrics are things that you wouldn't find in a Sunday newspaper or in teenage magazines in some way. But it was quite fun writing it. The mood of it was something that I liked, and there was a moment in Africa, in fact, when the one of the echo machines jammed, so it started malfunctioning, and I liked the sound of it, and so the loop is actually from this Delta Lab echo unit that was crapping out at the time. I was just thinking about, I think it's a depressed state, but where you suddenly have heightened consciousness of sound, and it's a bit like when you're about to throw up, suddenly smell goes into 3D, if you know what I mean, that it becomes a sort of heightened experience. So I was just trying to picture it, that this world in which the sounds, I mean, which I think is something that I know from my own experience, but your consciousness is sort of drifting, but there's some awareness that is retained. More Than This came right at the end, and I'd started a thing with guitar samples. I was mucking around with guitars, and Daniel Lenoir left this beautiful Telecaster here. I can't play guitar to save my life, but I can make noises on it, which sort of, it's like mirror guitar, you know, and hair flowing, but, or single hair flowing as it is now. And the samples we were getting, I was then manipulating them on the keyboard, and the first sound you hear on this track is that sort of thing. So that was built around that. But I'd always liked it, and in fact, I was actually driving through the Italian Alps. It's one of these scenic detours that I found this cassette which had got this stuff in, and then I've been playing around with a different sort of groove. And that started all to make sense to me at that point. Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan is, one of the most extraordinary singers, I think, of our time, and it was very sad for us to lose him. And I was very lucky that he'd worked on this track before he died, and it was. I don't know, it's just such a powerful thing that I was really keen to finish it and make it a sort of centerpiece for the record. And it was a much sort of starker thing that he sang to. But I wanted to try it in this string thing, and it's I think in a way most filmic, and I think they're going to be using the instrumental of this in Gangs of New York now, but I'm happy with that, because it always seemed a sort of a large visual song, and working with the strings at the end, that was a very slow process, and I spent sort of a week working through it with Will Gregory, who's been doing the Goldfrapp material with Alison, and but is another sort of local Bath person and very talented. And it's the sort of dirtiest I've got my hands in the actual sort of string arrangements, and that was very satisfying in terms of trying to generate also some melodic and harmonic things that were quite clashing in places, and then hear them all put together. So that was the other thrill for me on that track. I'm really hopeful that there'll be at least one other record out within sort of 18 months after this. So depends, how much touring and all the rest I do, but it shouldn't take that long. Touch wood to finish it off, because there are some tracks finished. Some I'm sure I'll rework a bit, but a lot of the writing has been done, and the lyric, which is often the longest, slowest part. I have quite a few lyrics now, so it feels good to have something in the bank, as it were.